Hi there, I'm Sarah Ramsden, and this is a short video to accompany my article in Amrita about yoga and injury. And what I'll be looking at is the way in which our teaching, particularly if we're teaching an asana like it's a shape, we're teaching a shape for an asana, can unknowingly to us exacerbate or even cause chronic injury in our students. And how, if we modify that teaching so that it's more in line with our functional anatomy, it's based on this idea of how we're designed to move. If we're teaching in line with that, then our teaching becomes really helpful to people, and it helps with the problems that their bodies often have. So as an illustration, I'm going to look at Warrior One, and I'm going to look at a kind of really exaggerated Warrior One, and then how we might modify this based on what's going to be helpful to people. Okay, so Warrior One. We all teach Warrior One, lots of variations of it, so let's take a really exaggerated one. So, right foot forward, and I'm stepping the left foot back, heels lined up with each other, with the left foot turned out. So this is kind of really exaggerated Warrior One. Although the foot's turned out, I turn the hips forward, so I square the hips forward, come forward bending the knee, and bring the arms up and over. So that's a kind of rather exaggerated Warrior One. So let's just have a look at this. So rather than looking at it as a shape, let's have a look at it in terms of how it's put together. So first off, whilst the natural position for my feet is directly underneath the hips, I step back and brought the heels in line. That rotates the pelvis outwards, obviously. I've also rotated my foot out, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, whatever. Then I squared the pelvis. So I brought the pelvis to face forward again. Let's hold here. What's happened now? Well, my foot turning out is turning my shin bones outwards, but my pelvis is turning inwards to bring it forward again. So my femur, my big thigh bone, is turning inwards. So the shin bone's being turned out, the femur's being turned inwards, and that combination rotates the knee. And the knee is not a rotational joint. It can cope with a little bit, but not much, and not repetitively. So we don't want to rotate the knee. So let's continue up that. Turn the foot out, brought the hips forward. Now, to bend the knee, the only way I'm going to get the pelvis forwards now is to stick my bottom right out. So now, instead of my pelvis being nice and neutral and normal and in a good position, what I've done is I have to stick my bottom out. And notice that creates a big curve in my lower back and a big lengthening on the front. So what's happening here? Let's look at that. Well, my hip, your hip, everybody's hip is pretty much designed the same way, give or take. And this movement, leg extension, as humans, we don't have very much leg extension. We have very little, in fact. So without the pelvis moving, pelvis neutral, you can always tell a neutral pelvis because the line on your leggings will be pretty level. Without my pelvis dipping or anteriorly tilting, I've only got about 20 degrees leg extension with a neutral pelvis. That's it. It's not much. To go beyond that, the only way of getting the leg back further is to do what I did in the Warrior One there. I tip the pelvis anteriorly, I drop it at the front, stick my arse into the air, and that means I change the position of the thigh bone in the hip socket, the acetabulum, and I can get much further back. However, it comes at a big cost. As I stick my arse into the air, I create compression in my lumbar. Big curve in the lower back creates compression in the lumbar. And it's an area that people often have compression in. They often have too much curve in the lumbar. So I'm creating even more curve. I'm putting more compression into an area that's already compressed. And I probably don't want to do that. And also, as I tilt the pelvis, and I drive the thigh bone forward to get that look of tremendous leg extension, this bone, my thigh bone, the femur, pushes forwards on the front of its own hip socket. And done repetitively, that creates inflammation at the front of the hip socket. And that becomes sore, it becomes stuck, it becomes inflamed and painful. And that's quite a common, if I look at the kind of standard yoga injury list, as in the injuries that people who do lots of yoga get, that's really, really common. That inflammation at the front of the hip socket, and it's very, very painful. So again, I probably don't want to do that to people. If they do it repetitively, it's going to hurt. As my lumbar, my lower back compressed and shortened with this big curve, my abdominals, because the pelvis dips down at the front, my abdominals, my lower abdominals stretched. And again, I've never met anyone who needed their abdominals stretching. Generally, we want the abdominals to engage, and most people, particularly in this lower band, need them to shorten, not lengthen. So as we lengthen people's abdominals, and if we're doing this in Warrior One, big lumbar compression, big stretch on the abs, people are probably then doing it in up-facing dog, in Cobra, in Anjani Asana, and we create an over-lengthening to the front, particularly the lower abdominals, and that starts taking stability away from people. But people need stability. We don't want to take it away from them. That's not going to help them. So coming back to my Warrior One, I've got the leg turned out. So there's my knee rotation. I'm driving the pelvis forward, pushing the femur forward as well. Big curve in the lower back, overstretch here. Now, to get the arms up, because most people are rounded in the upper back, what they do is they lift the rib cage as a single piece and push it back. So rather than changing the shape of the upper body, because if people are rounded, what we want to do is to extend, is thoracic extension, lengthen out the rib cage. What people do is tilt the whole thing as a single piece. And that doesn't change anything, but what it does do is it creates a hinge point where the bottom of the ribs, T12, joins the top of the lumbar, L1, and that hinge point becomes overused, because people will then do it in every back bend. So it becomes too mobile, you get too much mobility at one vertebrae, not enough mobility at the ones around it, and creating instability, and ultimately you'll get the whole inflammation spasming into the spine, and this is not good. So, rather than doing all those things, given that we're going to instruct Warrior One, how about we instruct it so that it's really helpful to people? So let's just think about that. What would be helpful? Well, here's our guiding principles. This is what we want to be teaching. The leg, hip, knee, ankle alignment. That's what your leg really, really wants. Your knee hates being rotated. So let's not rotate it. We want to keep those lining up. At the pelvis, we want the pelvis to stay generally neutral. And that way the lower back is happy. It's not being compressed. If my pelvis stays level, my lower back stays just normal, just natural, without that big compression. I want the abs to engage. I want them to contract inwards and engage, because that's really helpful to people's torso stability. I want the rib cage, because people are generally rounded, I want the thorax and the thoracic spine to, keeping the bottom rib down, I want it to actually change shape, so that people are able to straighten out the big curve in the upper back, not just tip it backwards. So what would Warrior One look like if we had those principles? Well, the feet would be naturally hip distance apart, and they're going to stay hip distance apart. When I step back, hip, knee, ankle alignment, that means the foot's going to face forward, or to make the pose possible, will be on the balls and toes of the back foot. And that's, you see that's very common in teaching now, and it's really, really excellent. At the pelvis, instead of sticking my arse out, engage my abs, pull the pubic bone up to keep the pelvis level. There's my nice level pelvis. Now, I can't do that with a straight leg because I have to tilt the pelvis to keep the leg straight. So, as I tuck under, level out the pelvis, notice my back knee bends. That allows me to keep my pelvis neutral. The abs draw inwards. So now I'm engaging the abs, I'm contracting this lower band of abs rather than stretching them. At the thorax, at the ribs, I keep the bottom rib down, but I lengthen through the other ribs. So the bottom rib stays fixed using my nice strong obliques, and I lengthen through the rest of the rib cage. That changes the shape of the rib cage. The arms come up, and I'm now in a warrior one that's helpful to people. Hip, knee, ankle alignment, nice neutral pelvis, happy hip, happy lower back, abs engaged, and the rib cage actually trying to change shape and flatten the curve in the upper back. So what I did there was I simply took the guiding principles of our anatomy and applied them to Warrior One, and with special reference to the kind of common problems that people have, like an over-rounded upper back. How do I sort that out? Too much compression in the lumbar, in the lower back. How can I help that? So I apply them, and I come out with something that's not dissimilar, but it's really, really helpful to people. And given that we're going to instruct it anyway, wouldn't it be wonderful if our instructions really helped people rather than contributed to chronic problems, either that they already have or that we unknowingly create? I really hope this has been useful to you, and I've enjoyed doing it, and yeah, I hope that it helps you. Thank you very much.